Professor Chomsky, it is an absolute privilege and a pleasure to chair this Ogre Youth for Irish Unity event with you as the guest speaker, and to give some of us the opportunity to ask you a question, and to give the many more who have tuned in online the pleasure of listening to you. In 2015, I represented Sinn Féin at an Emancipation and Equality Conference in Argentina. And I had to leave a day early to lead a delegation of MEPs to Palestine. And a dinner was arranged with yourself and your wife, a private dinner for myself to engage with you. And that's been one of the most precious moments in my life. Over dinner, we talked about Ireland and Palestine and about the right to self-determination. And so, Professor, it's that point which I want to start off tonight's proceedings. Noam, if you can allow me to call you that, can I ask you, considering the internationally recognised legitimacy of the Irish Unity provision as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, what is your view on Irish reunification?
Well, Palestine is a very good analogy. There are cases of populations around the world which have been denied the right to self-determination. There are different causes in different places. Palestine, one set of circumstances. The Kurdish population of the world is another case. Western Sahara is a case very much like Palestine, occupied by, in this case, Morocco, illegally imposing its brutal rule. Ireland is another case, hundreds of years in this case, of oppression and violence. The Irish case has its own special conditions, as each case does. One of the problems in Ireland is internal unity, as incidentally it is in Palestine, where there's disunity among Palestinians that is impeding the struggle for self-determination and basic human and civil rights. Same problem in Ireland. That internal division is something that has to be overcome. But the case for, general case for unification of Ireland as an independent, free country, free to pursue the interests of its citizens by their choice and their decision. I think that's a well-established right. Many barriers to overcome to achieve it, as in all these other cases, but that's part of the forward march of history. A long time in coming in the case of Ireland, 800 years, in fact, almost in the millennium. That's not a short period, but there are steps forward and further ones can be attained.
Thank you for that. Jake Harkin is the chair of Ogre Youth for Irish Unity, and he's going to ask the next question. Jake.
So, Professor, Ireland over the last 800 years has been viewed as a test case for British imperialism. So, what is your view on British imperial policy in Ireland?
It's a test case, but unfortunately for other places, it's a case that's not unique. The history of the only good thing you can say about British imperialism is that the imperialism of other states is no better. And it's a horror story from beginning to end. Britain repeatedly intervened in Irish affairs, took it over, carried out massacres, imposed brutal famines for no need, stole the best land. I remember years ago, 1993, I happened to I drove with a friend, an Irish friend, from Dublin to Belfast. And on the way, we stopped by the home of a farmer whose son had just been killed by British soldiers. His farm was full of watchtowers, British watchtowers. He took me on a walk through the fields, showed me how the best land had been stolen by Cromwell's army in this case, and what was left was barely viable land for Irish farmers like himself, and went through the brutal history from those days up until his son's recent death. And that's a microcosm of a story. Britain stole higher Irish technology in weaving, just as it did from the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and dramatically from India. India had been the richest, most powerful country in the world when the British East India Company landed, had about 25% of world gross domestic product, far more advanced than Britain in technology and production, textiles, steel. Britain had the guns, basically what they had, and the culture of violence, and was able to deindustrialize India, steal its higher technology, turn it into a harsh, suffering, brutal place. Britain finally exited with a setting the stage for an enormous massacre. You could call that a test case. In fact, just about everywhere you look, British imperialism has been a complete horror story. In fact, if you look at the source of British wealth, a good part of it comes from first piracy during the Elizabethan period, robbing, stealing. Pirates like Sir Francis Drake were attacking Spanish ships, stealing the bullion, other sources. A large part of the wealth of Elizabethan England came from that. Then initiating the worst system of slavery in human history, first in the Caribbean islands, then in what became the United States, British colonists, finally turning to the world's greatest narco-trafficking empire when the British gunboats beat their way into China, along with India, the most advanced country in the world before Britain smashed them. That's British imperialism. On a smaller scale, French imperialism, pretty much the same. US imperialism has been a horror story from its origins. German imperialism, the same. Britain was preeminent until the Second World War. So its long record of imperial savagery may stand alone, but in its character, it's not different from other imperial records which have defaced history. In the case of Ireland is a particularly ugly example, persistent for almost a millennium, one blow after another, never relenting, finally forced to abandon some areas of control, but still not over. Not far from where you are, you, I'm sure, will all soon be commemorating the savage of Bloody Sunday, one hideous episode in 800 years of violence, savagery, repression, robbery, famine, every kind of violation of basic human rights and dignity that you can think of.
Well, Emma McGinley is a new Sinn Féin councillor for Derry, and Emma will ask the next question.
Thank you for that. Professor, just how cruel would you say imperialism is, and how damaging is the long-term impact of imperialism in a country that has been embroiled, or perhaps still is, in an anti-imperial struggle?
Well, as I said, the long-term history has been extremely destructive. In fact, we now make a distinction between the North and the South, the First World and the Third World. You go back a couple hundred years, that barely existed. The difference between the very rich, the very poor countries was nothing like today. In fact, the major powers in the world right into the 18th century were China and India. Western Europe was a kind of barbaric outpost. It did have advantages. It had a culture of savagery and violence, which allowed, along with military forces, military advantages, allowed Northwestern Europe, Britain in the lead, to conquer the world and destroy most of it. It's China, India, the two major examples, but it's universal. And you can see the effect dramatically when you look at the parts of the global South that have somehow developed. Actually, there's one, Japan, the one country in the South that was able to resist Western imperialism, American and British in this case. The one country that resisted the imperial domination, the one country that developed, bringing along its own colonies in tow. It was also a violent and brutal imperialist power in its own domains, but its own former colonies, now Taiwan and South Korea, also developed within the Japanese model. If you go back to the late 19th century, Japan was about at the same level as West Africa. The kingdoms of West Africa were on the verge of development. They had administrative structure, resources. They had, of course, been severely, brutally damaged by stealing away from them much of their young adult population to become the victims of hideous, vicious slavery of Britain, France, and the British offshoots in what's now the United States. Nevertheless, they were at a level of development, African historians point out, which was quite comparable to Japan. There was one difference. Japan had resisted imperial domination. West Africa hadn't. West Africa became impoverished, life in misery, people fleeing for their lives, dying in the Mediterranean. Japan's a flourishing industrial society. The difference is imperial control. There are many other dramatic and illuminating examples. So go back a little earlier in history, to the early 19th century, say 1820. Compare Egypt and what was then the United States. They were about at the same level of development. they both had the world's most important commodity, cotton. Cotton was the oil of the 19th century, the basis for industrialization, finance, commerce, cheap cotton. In the United States, it was gotten by hideous, brutal, savage slavery. In Egypt, it was poor peasants. Egypt was a rich agricultural country. That's why one of the main reasons Napoleon had conquered it, because he wanted the rich agriculture, strategically placed, rich energy and water resources. It was then under the rule of a modernizing autocrat, Mehmet Ali. Every reason why Egypt could have developed the same way the United States did. One difference: British imperialism. The British, Lord Palmerston and others, said straight out, frankly, didn't hide it, we are not going to permit any competition to British domination in the Mediterranean region. We will crush any attempt at Egyptian moves towards self-determination and independence. Well, they succeeded brutally right through the century, right until they were finally thrown out in 1956. By then, Egypt had lost over a century of opportunity to develop. So Egypt is Egypt, Britain is Britain. You can see this all over, every place you look. In the 1980s, the United States, Haiti has had a hideous, horrible history. 1980s, the United States took over Haiti again, brutally as it had repeatedly done, inaugurated programs which were going to turn Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean. Well, there was a difference. Taiwan was independent. It could use its own self-direction, resources, planning to become a leading industrial country. Haiti had to follow US rules, imperial rules. Haiti is, again, one of the most impoverished countries in the world. You can follow this record all throughout modern history. And that's the answer to the question, what has been the impact of imperialism? Is there an anti-imperial struggle? It's constant. Imperialism always takes new, different forms, just as imperialism is basically a form of class struggle. And just as class struggle constantly takes new forms of repression and violence, so does imperialism. So in the 1980s, Latin America, other so-called developing countries were making significant progress. They were caught in a cycle of indebtedness caused by World Bank lending way beyond in a manner which had made no sense, sponsored by the United States. When the US raised interest rates, they couldn't pay. They fell under IMF control, had structural adjustment programs imposed on them, lost 20 years of development, went back into crushing poverty. These same programs, a different form of imperial control, had horrifying effects in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, setting the stage for the atrocities that later occurred. You crush a country by violent, bitter structural adjustment programs. We know what they are. It does exacerbate ethnic tensions under harsh outside control. ethnic violence rises and becomes very serious. We just saw that in the Middle East. When the US invaded Iraq, US and Britain, a textbook example of the kind of aggression that led Nazi war criminals to be hanged at Nuremberg. One of the consequences was to incite ethnic conflict, which hadn't existed before. Shia and Sunni populations lived pretty much in harmony. They lived in the same places, they intermarried, they often didn't know who was who. They regarded each other the way maybe different Protestant sects regard each other in the United States. A couple of years of violent, brutal US-British imperial aggression. They were at each other's throats. Horrifying conflict developed, tearing the region apart as it spread through the region. A recent example of the triumph of imperialism and the need for an anti-imperial struggle, which never ends, goes on constantly, taking new forms at every moment. In Ireland, Brexit, the recent Brexit decision, is both another form of imperial domination and an opportunity for an anti-imperial struggle. These things often coincide, and but it's, to answer the question, it's a never-ending struggle until we have a world of relatively free and equal societies. You're going to find imperialism, just as internally to society, when we have sharp class differentiations, concentration of wealth and power, and decision-making in one group, they're going to be engaged in bitter class struggle to control the rest. These are just consequences of radical inequality.
Professor Niamh Watson is a member of the Ogra Youth for Unity, and she is going to ask you the next question. Niamh.
Professor, what role do you think youth movements play in enacting change worldwide?
Well, if you look over modern history again, you'll notice that young people have been at the forefront of just about every major progressive change that has taken place. And take right now, right across the Irish Sea a couple of weeks ago in Glasgow, there was a crucial event. Actually, two events took place. COP26. One event took place within the stately halls where the men in the suits and jackets and ties and the well-dressed women were conferring and figuring out how not to do anything to solve the most important crisis in human history. About the main decision they came up with was to meet again next year while the world burns. That was inside the halls. Outside the halls, another event took place. Tens of thousands of people, almost all young, demanding that those inside adopt the measures that we know are available to save the human species from destruction and innumerable other species that we're destroying, and to create the way for a better world. That's pretty common. It's young people who have been at the forefront of efforts to try to lead the way to a better world. In the United States, go back to the civil rights movement, who was on the front line? Young SNCC workers, young Black students in the South who were going through Alabama in freedom buses, facing severe dangers and threats, sometimes getting killed, trying to encourage a black farmer to take his life in his hands and register to vote. They were the front line. They were later joined by young people from the North, created the basis for the great demonstrations and actions, which finally led to some civil rights legislation. Take a look at the anti-war movement. A couple of years later, same thing. Forefront were young people, some of them young men who refused to serve, went to jail, went to exile, put their lives on the line. Feminist movement, late 60s, early 70s, almost all young women, raising consciousness groups, acting to gain rights. It's almost it's a kind of a near universal, and it's kind of understandable. I mean, people at your age, basically, are in some ways at the moment of your lives when you're most free. You're out of parental control. You're not yet in a situation where you've got to devote your life in a harsh society to put food on the table for your family. You have a certain degree of freedom. Not all, of course, but that's the period of people who are roughly your age group. And it makes a difference. There are opportunities to think things through, question dogma, question doctrine, think clearly, not under the control of doctrinal systems. I mean, yes, the educational system is one, but you can work your way through it. And a certain degree of freedom to act, to make choices and to act. And it's been shown over and over. So the answer to the question is youth movements can continue as in the past in helping to enact positive change in their own countries and worldwide. It's in the future. The most important of all, puts everything else in the shadow, is what was happening in Glasgow. If we don't solve that problem, nothing else matters. Have a decade or two to solve it, not a long time. Know how, but it's going to take a tremendous amount of work. In fact, if you look closely at what the suits and ties were doing in Glasgow, you can see what a task it's going to be. So there was a lot of euphoria in the official sessions in Glasgow. You might have heard John Kerry, the US ambassador and negotiator, was ecstatic about the fact that a major triumph was achieved. The movement to stop global warming now has the market on its side. The rich and powerful have joined us, and they're going to contribute massively to solving the problem. In fact, the major investment firms announced that they have $130 trillion that they're going to use to combat warming of the environment, destruction of the environment. So how can we lose? Could you look at the footnotes? Turns out, yeah, they said they have $130 trillion, but in the footnotes, which we're willing to invest in profitable investment, as long as we're guaranteed that there will be no risk, that the IMF will issue a guarantee that if our investments aren't risky and fail, we'll be compensated. So we're perfectly willing to join the struggle as long as we can make money and can't lose. That's the great triumph. Okay, that's imperialism, that's class war, all encapsulated inside the halls at Glasgow. Wherever you look, you're going to find the same thing. And you have to be attuned to it, not taken in by the pleasant words, the propaganda, the nice pat on the head saying, nice boy, nice girl, go home, we'll take care of it. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to force the barriers to open and to be overcome. And then it will be possible to get out of this extraordinarily dangerous situation we're in and develop a far better world, locally, globally.
Professor Chomsky, the person who secured your attendance here this evening, someone you know, Matthew O'Reilly, Ogre Youth for Unity member, he'll ask the next question.
Thank you very much, Martina. Professor, you referred heavily to climate change in your last answer. So I'm wondering, how do you believe a united Ireland could go about tackling the global climate emergency?
Well, actually, we know the answers. There are careful, detailed plans that have been programs that have been worked out that would suffice to deal with the contemporary emergency and to open the door to much further progress within maybe 2 to 3% of the gross domestic product of the wealthy countries. Remember that the crisis has not been caused by the human species. It's been caused by the rich countries, and more accurately, by the rich people in the rich countries. Poor people in the United States and England have contributed very little. People in the global south have contributed almost nothing. It's the rich people in the rich countries who have poisoned the atmosphere, destroyed agriculture with highly dangerous industrialized agriculture, meat production, crop production, destroyed habitats. Overwhelmingly, they're the ones that did it. And at a very small percentage of their wealth, their unearned wealth, it's possible to deal with these crises. There are detailed plans that come from the International Energy Agency, from prominent economists, my colleague Robert Pollin, Jeffrey Sachs, others. There's a resolution in Congress initiated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, young representative who came in on the Sanders wave, along with Ed Markey, a senior Massachusetts senator. Two of them have an environmental program in Congress. All of these programs are very similar. They are all worked out in extensive detail. They involve less funding than the Treasury Department in the United States just poured in to keep the stock market going during the pandemic, literally. All within reach. Problem is class struggle. Get the rich and powerful to agree to do it. If you look at their words, they say, fine, we agree with you. So ExxonMobil, for example, major fossil fuel company in the United States, has wonderful words, says, we're with you. We want to help you. We are in favor of net zero emissions by mid-century. So just go away, you young people, let us take over and do it. Then you look at the footnotes. Yes, net zero emissions under the condition explicit, I'm quoting, no elimination, only innovation. So no cutback in fossil fuel use, but let's put money into inventing something which may or may not exist someday, which will take the poisons out of the air that we're pouring in. That's the way they'll get to net zero emissions. Okay, That's the way class struggle works. You can't be fooled by it. You have to penetrate the propaganda, the deception, the repression, overcome it. It's going to be a harsh struggle. If the Republican Party in the United States comes back to office next year, which it may, and if Donald Trump comes back 2 years later, we may literally be finished. They're a denialist party, ultra right-wing party, denying climate change, denying rights. Under Trump, the US raced forward to try to destroy the climate as fast as possible. Another couple of years of this, we may be past irreversible tipping points. Plenty. It's not that the rest are so marvelous. Plenty to do everywhere else. But it's going to be a hard struggle. And to answer the specific questions, we know how to go about it. The means are there. They're feasible. They can be achieved. And there are steps forward. Shouldn't overlook them. To take the United States again. One of the worst offenders is coal. Coal is the most destructive producer of greenhouse gas. Well, the coal mining, the United Mine Workers in the United States has just agreed to a transitional program in which mine workers will move away from coal mining to renewable energy at a very limited social cost. They quite rightly want to be compensated for the loss of their jobs. They want to be trained for the new jobs that are opening up. You count up how the amount of money required for that. It's a rounding error in the federal budget, literally. You wouldn't even notice it. And it can be done, and they're willing to do it. But will those who dominate the world, those who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, the concentrated capital and the states they control, will they do it? That's going to take plenty of pressure. And that pressure is mostly going to come from young people. So we know how to tackle it. There are steps forward. There are positive measures. Just have to work much harder to get them implemented. And it's your challenge and responsibility.
Professor Chomsky, the final question this evening will be asked by Ogre Youth for Unity member Jude Higgerty.
Professor, how do you believe a United Ireland could go about tackling socio-economic issues?
Sorry, could you say it again?
Professor, how do you believe that a United Ireland could go about tackling socio-economic issues?
Well, now we're back to class struggle. That's a continual battle all the time. It'll be a battle in a united Ireland. There will be new possibilities in a united Ireland that don't exist in a divided Ireland. For elements that are combating each other, fighting each other, undermining the hopes for progress, they can be working together. And this can happen. I mean, let's go back to another personal anecdote. That trip that I mentioned from Dublin to Belfast back in 1993, I had some quite interesting experiences. I was driven by a young woman, Northern Irish Catholic woman, civil rights activist. I mentioned her name, I'm sure you'd know her. She took me to, she's the one who took me to that farmer's home. When we got to Belfast, this same young woman was organizing groups of Catholic and Protestant activists to meet together to talk. Took me to a meeting. Jerry Adams was one of the people who was there, and others. There were sharp disagreements, but there was civil discussion. There were initiatives discussed that could have led to overcoming the terrible crisis. You remember 1993, it was the peak of the violence. You couldn't park a car in Belfast without having to open the trunk of the car so it'd be inspected by police to make sure there'd be no explosives in it. I gave talks in both the Catholic and Protestant areas. Friends of mine from one area were afraid to go to the other one. It was, well, I went back to Belfast about 15 years later, I guess, and it's what you see. Not perfect harmony by any means. You can see problems, but it's a united city. People can work together. And that can be generalized to Ireland altogether. Once these conflicts are overcome, people find their common interests, which overwhelm the interests that divide them. They can work together. To go back to Palestine, which you mentioned earlier, I think the same can be true there. Jews and Palestinians basically have the same common interests. They can't pursue them as long as they're at each other's throats. And of course, there's no symmetry. It's one group has its jackboot on the neck of the other. But when they can overcome these, they can work together for a much better world. And the same will be true in a united Ireland, which sooner or later will come. I think signs are there. The ridiculous complexities introduced by Brexit make it clearer than it was in the past that these artificial divisions just can't survive. And just as it has been done to an extent internally, I think it can be done between the parts of divided Ireland, the 6 counties, and the Republic. And when it's overcome, should rejoin the European Union. That's the best outcome for the future. Lots of artificial distinctions and barriers, and conflicts will be gone. And then you'll be in a much better place to carry out the constant, permanent class struggle of trying to achieve social, socioeconomic, decent existence, overcome inequality, hierarchy, oppression, not just socioeconomic, but in other areas of life as well. Women's rights, for example, which recently made a forward stride in Ireland and are going backward in the United States. Same issue. Well, that's a constant battle. Battles for rights, justice, they go on forever. You make some progress, there's some regression, you fight harder and you go on. And it can happen in Ireland as it's happened there in the past, and it's happened elsewhere.
Professor Noam Chomsky, it has been an absolute honour chairing tonight's event. You have been a breath of fresh air, and we want to thank you for giving so generously of your time. You will be talked about all over Ireland tonight, and I believe in the weeks, months, and perhaps years ahead. So, on behalf of us all, I want to say thank you, go Minimagat, and long live international solidarity and support.
And let me thank you for what you're doing, which is the hope of the future.